Hey everyone, tonight, we're drifting back to a time before toothpaste, before deodorant, and before the concept of personal space, just a small, quiet thing. If you like drifting off to strange corners of history, you can leave a like or subscribe. Quietly, of course. It helps the channel, and it tells me you'd like more sleepy stories like this one. But for now, just relax. So, go ahead, dim the lights, get comfortable, and imagine yourself stepping quietly through the creaky wooden door of another age. The medieval world awaits, though, I'll be honest, you might want to hold your breath for parts of it. Now, if you've ever daydreamed about time traveling to the Middle Ages, maybe you've imagined strolling through a castle courtyard, or sitting at a long banquet table lit by flickering candlelight, this episode is for you. But before you set the dials on your imaginary time machine, I feel obligated to offer a few gentle warnings. Because while the medieval era looks picturesque from a distance, stone towers against pink sunsets, knights on horseback, courtly love songs wafting through the air, the closer you get, the more it starts to smell like centuries of unwashed wool. So tonight, we'll take it slow. We'll drift through the centuries, quietly, and I'll tell you what to expect if you ever do find yourself back there, somewhere between 1100 and 1450. Give or take a plague or two. And first things first, let's talk about arriving. Imagine your time machine sputters to life. You step out, perhaps expecting cobblestone streets and cheerful villagers. Instead, you land ankle deep in something that looks suspiciously like mud, and smells suspiciously not like mud. Congratulations, you've arrived in medieval Europe, where sanitation was a concept that existed mostly as a rumor. If you appear in a city, say, London, Paris, or Florence, try not to breathe too deeply. Streets were often open sewers, filled with refuse from homes, taverns, and animals. People would toss chamber pots directly out of upper windows. There were no warning signs, only the occasional shout of guard as low. Watch out for the water. As a polite way of saying, duck, there's urine incoming. If you must walk through town, keep your mouth closed. The air is textured. And maybe don't make too much eye contact with anyone, because you will look strange. Your clothes will seem absurdly clean. Your teeth will sparkle suspiciously. And your posture, well, centuries of malnutrition have not done wonders for theirs. Now, you might think, I'll just blend in. You won't. Even if you put on period-appropriate clothes, you'll still stand out. You'll speak strangely, your accent alone will get you accused of witchcraft or espionage, depending on the decade. And your skin will probably look too healthy, too unblemished. Medieval life was a constant conversation between dirt, disease, and destiny. If you happen to be a man, and you land in, say, 14th century England, you might try to grow a beard to fit in. That's good. Beards were fashionable in some eras. Just remember, razors were expensive, and soap was mostly made from animal fat and ash. You'll smell like an overcooked candle, but so will everyone else, so that's fine. If you're a woman, well, good luck explaining your independence. Unless you arrive in a convent, a marriage, or a royal court, there aren't many respectable places for you to exist alone. Best to say you're a widow. People in the Middle Ages adored widows. They were mysterious, usually quiet, and, importantly, not anyone's legal property. Let's drift, now, into the question of food. Because, inevitably, you'll get hungry. And if you're imagining a grand medieval feast, a roaring fire, a boar's head on a platter, goblets of red wine, well, that did happen, sometimes. If you're extremely lucky, or extremely rich. For everyone else, food was repetitive, seasonal, and, how shall I put this, texturally adventurous. Bread was the universal staple, but not the soft, fluffy kind. Medieval bread could probably dent a helmet. It was coarse, full of husks, and occasionally, thanks to poor storage, full of insects. Peasants might eat pottage, a thick stew of grains, beans, and whatever vegetables they could find. Meat was rare. Fish was common, especially on Fridays, when the church banned meat entirely. And then there was ale. People drank it constantly, not because they were alcoholics, but because the water was often unsafe. A nice weak ale was considered breakfast. Children drank it. Nuns drank it. Even monks, who took vows of moderation, brewed some fairly aggressive batches. If you're wondering about coffee or tea, sorry, those hadn't arrived yet. If you're desperate for caffeine, your best option is to chew willow bark, which doubles as a primitive painkiller. Handy, considering the next thing we should discuss, medicine. Now, I should warn you, if you fall ill in the Middle Ages, do not mention you're from the future. That's just going to make things worse. Medicine was an earnest but highly confused field. Doctors, those lucky few who had studied at a university, believed in balancing the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Everything, from fevers to heartbreak, was caused by your humors being out of balance. The solution? Bloodletting, usually. So if you go to a doctor, you'll probably meet a barber surgeon, someone whose daily routine includes cutting hair, pulling teeth, and occasionally amputating legs. He'll strap you down, produce a knife that hasn't been washed since the Crusades, and confidently declare that this will release the bad air. On the other hand, if you can't afford a doctor, you might see a local wise woman or herbalist. They'll give you potions made from plants and, occasionally, small animals. Many of these actually worked, though no one quite knew why. A few centuries later, the church would call this witchcraft, so, again, maybe don't mention where you're from. Let's drift toward another practical concern: safety. Medieval Europe was not the lawless wasteland people imagine, but it also wasn't what you'd call secure. Roads were rough, forests were full of bandits, and justice, such as it was, often came down to whoever owned the most swords. If you're traveling through the countryside, don't go alone. Bandits were opportunistic, and travelers made easy targets. Try to join a merchant caravan or pretend to be a pilgrim. Pilgrims were everywhere, walking across Europe to visit holy relics, usually carrying little badges to prove their destination. Nobody asked too many questions. If you end up in a castle, congratulations. But remember, castles were not as glamorous as they look in movies. They were cold, smoky, and dark. The walls were drafty, the floors uneven, and the fireplaces, despite their size, barely heated anything except the people sitting directly in front of them. Also, don't sit too close to the lord or lady of the house. Medieval nobles were touchy about rank, and you, time traveler, have none. A misplaced comment about hygiene or the future could land you in the stocks, or worse, in a dungeon. Speaking of nobles, let's talk about manners. If you're invited to a medieval meal, consider it a high honor and an extreme test of your stomach. The etiquette was elaborate but not exactly hygienic. Forks were rare, knives were shared, and napkins were mostly theoretical. Diners used the tablecloth, their sleeves, or sometimes the dog. People didn't eat in courses as we do today. Everything came out at once, a noisy, chaotic spread of meats, stews, pies, and pastries, all served with bread that doubled as both plate and sponge. When it was too soaked with sauce, you tossed it to the servants or the dogs. And don't be alarmed if your host starts loudly slurping soup or tossing bones over his shoulder. That was normal. In fact, eating too neatly might make you seem suspicious, like someone trying to pass for nobility. If you happen to dine with royalty, do not, under any circumstances, comment on the smell. Medieval kings and queens often reeked of perfume, meant to mask other, less regal scents. Bathing was rare and, in some cases, actively discouraged. Henry IV of France was said to bathe only a few times a year. Elizabeth I took great pride in her cleanliness because she bathed once a month. So, you see the problem. Let's drift, now, into the more philosophical side of things, what people believed. In medieval Europe, religion was not a private affair, it was life itself. The church governed everything from marriage to what you could eat. Time was measured not by clocks, but by bells, matins, vespers, compline. The afterlife felt as real as the earth beneath one's feet. If you say you're from the future, where the world revolves around science, you'll get one of two reactions. Either people will ignore you, assuming you're mad, or they'll take you very seriously, and burn you. So keep your knowledge to yourself. Don't mention that the Earth orbits the Sun. Don't try to explain germs. And please, for your own sake, don't attempt to fix anything. Medieval people didn't like things being fixed. They liked them being ordained. And then, of course, there's love. If you're hoping to find romance in the Middle Ages, prepare for disappointment. Courtly love was a poetic ideal, not a practical reality. Real marriages were mostly business arrangements, alliances, property exchanges, political bargains. A woman might be married off at 12, a man at 14, and both would spend the rest of their lives pretending it was destiny. Affairs were common, but dangerous. If you were caught, the punishment could range from humiliation to mutilation. That didn't stop anyone, of course, but it did keep things tense. If you must flirt, do so carefully. A polite bow, a cryptic compliment, maybe a reference to the lady's eyes being brighter than the moon, though, depending on the season, the moon may be your only light source, so perhaps save that for nighttime. Before we drift further, let's pause and reflect on one small mercy: you will not be alone in your discomfort. Everyone, from peasant to prince, lived in a constant state of mild suffering. Shoes were stiff, winters were brutal, and medical care was optimistic at best. The good news is that people didn't expect comfort, they expected endurance. And somehow, that made life bearable. They laughed, told stories, sang songs. They celebrated feast days with gusto, because when life is hard and short, you don't skip the party. As your eyes grow heavier and your imagination starts to wander, just picture it: a smoky great hall, the low hum of a lute, the soft glow of candlelight reflecting off pewter cups. You're sitting quietly, listening to the chatter of voices that speak of harvests and saints, of plagues and miracles. You know that, outside, the wind carries the scent of rain over thatched roofs. Inside, the world is warm and small, and, for just a moment, you belong. But don't get too comfortable. We've still got a few centuries to drift through. Next, we'll wander deeper into the lives of those who ruled this strange, fragrant world, the kings and queens of medieval Europe. Their fortunes, their follies, and their very questionable genetics. So, if you're still awake, let's drift there now. Hey everyone, if you're still awake, welcome back. Let's keep drifting, quietly this time, into the candlelit halls and perfumed chambers of Europe's royal courts. Places where the carpets were rich, the bloodlines were richer, and the gene pool was alarmingly shallow. Because, as we all know, royalty in medieval and early modern Europe had a bit of a family problem. They didn't like to share power with outsiders. They preferred to keep things in the family, very in the family. And while this kept the crown secure, it also ensured that, generation by generation, Europe's monarchs grew frailer, sicker, and, well, less intellectually agile than one might hope for someone in charge of an empire. So tonight, we'll drift through their gilded, gloomy lives. We'll meet kings who couldn't chew their food properly, queens who married their nephews, and entire dynasties that seemed to be held together by ambition, superstition, and wishful thinking. Let's start somewhere warm and a little tragic. Let's drift over to Spain. If you were to visit Madrid in the 17th century, you'd find yourself in a kingdom that looked powerful, sun-drenched, immense, and glittering with gold from the New World. But underneath the grandeur was a dynasty quietly imploding. At the center of it all was Charles II of Spain, sometimes called El Hechizado, the Bewitched. A nickname that, unfortunately, was not a compliment. Charles was the last of the Spanish Habsburgs, a family so inbred that their family tree looked less like a tree and more like a tangled vine choking itself. His parents were uncle and niece, his grandparents were first cousins, and nearly everyone in his family had the same two great-great-grandparents. It was less of a royal bloodline and more of a genetic loop. Charles himself was the product of about 200 years of dynastic recycling. He was born sickly, with a large head, a weak jaw, and a tongue so oversized he could barely speak or chew. One courtier wrote, delicately, that His Majesty suffers from a certain slowness of understanding. Which was the 17th century diplomatic way of saying, the lights are on, but no one's home. He didn't walk until he was 8, and he didn't speak until he was 4. The royal physicians, who believed all maladies were caused by unbalanced humors, recommended bleeding him, purging him, and feeding him ground-up pearls. None of it helped, of course, but it did make his illnesses more expensive. Still, Charles was king, and that meant people had to pretend everything was fine. Ministers issued decrees in his name, courtiers bowed deeply, and artists painted flattering portraits that softened his famously drooping features. But behind the silks and ceremony, Spain was falling apart. The economy was failing, the colonies were restless, and the royal family was frantically trying to produce an heir. Charles married twice. First to Marie Louise of Orleans, who was beautiful, kind, and, tragically, completely uninterested in him. She died young, possibly from exhaustion, stress, or sheer despair. His second wife, Marianne of Neuburg, came from a family famous for producing healthy heirs. She arrived with an entourage of doctors and priests, but even divine intervention couldn't undo centuries of inbreeding. Charles remained childless, frail, and superstitious. He became convinced that witches had cursed him. To break the spell, he ordered his mother's corpse exhumed so her body could be inspected for signs of sorcery. It was not. He died in 1700 at the age of 38, childless and pitiful, his jaw swollen and his body covered in sores. When the royal physicians performed an autopsy, they reported that his heart was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs rotted, and his intestines putrefied. His head, they said, was full of water. It was, in a way, the perfect metaphor for the Habsburg dynasty itself. When he died, Spain's throne passed to the Bourbons of France, ending nearly 200 years of Habsburg rule, and ensuring that Europe would immediately go to war about it. All because no one thought to marry outside the family. Let's drift north now, toward Austria, the other great Habsburg nest. The Austrian Habsburgs were slightly more functional than their Spanish cousins, but only just. They, too, believed that the purest bloodline was the one that never strayed far from the family chapel. By the 16th century, Habsburg marriage proposals had become an international punchline. The family motto, often repeated with a smirk, was Bella Geron Alii, tu Felix Austria nube. Let others wage war, thou, happy Austria, marry. And they did. Repeatedly. Usually to each other. One of the more famous products of this tradition was Emperor Leopold I, who ruled the Holy Roman Empire in the late 1600s. Leopold was clever and deeply pious, but also, shall we say, not photogenic. One historian described him as having a large, drooping lower lip and a chin of heroic proportions. In portraits, he looks like he's halfway through a very slow sneeze. Leopold married 3 times, 2 of his wives were his close cousins. Between wars, plagues, and childbirth, the family managed to keep the bloodline going, but each generation seemed to get a little weaker, a little stranger. By the time Maria Theresa came along in the 18th century, the only female ruler of the Habsburg lands, the dynasty was wobbling but still standing. She was intelligent, hardworking, and devoted to her 16 children. One of them, Marie Antoinette, would eventually lose her head in France. Which, to be fair, was one of the least embarrassing Habsburg outcomes. Let's drift further east now, to the glittering, frigid court of Russia. Because if you thought Western Europe's royals were dysfunctional, wait until you meet the Romanovs. The Romanovs had everything: wealth, power, and an impressive talent for melodrama. They were constantly marrying into German and Danish royalty, bringing with them a steady trickle of both political alliances and questionable genes. Take Tsar Nicholas II, the last emperor of Russia. He was a gentle man, devoted husband, and hopeless ruler. His wife, Alexandra, was the granddaughter of Queen Victoria, a woman whose family tree, by the late 1800s, looked like a pan-European web of slightly anxious cousins. The couple had 4 daughters before finally producing a long-awaited son, Alexei. But Alexei was born with hemophilia, a condition that prevents blood from clotting, thanks to a recessive gene passed down from Queen Victoria herself. It was a cruel irony. The royal families of Europe, obsessed with maintaining pure blood, had instead inherited a disease that made blood their greatest weakness. Desperate for a cure, Alexandra turned to faith healers and mystics. One of them, of course, was the infamous Grigory Rasputin, a bearded wanderer who claimed to have divine healing powers and absolutely no concept of boundaries. He became a constant presence at court, advising the empress, charming the servants, and horrifying everyone else. His influence helped unravel what little stability remained in the Romanov regime. By the time the Russian Revolution arrived, the dynasty was already broken by superstition, secrecy, and generations of ill-advised cousin marriages. The royal family's end, as we know, was tragic. And while their deaths were the result of politics, their downfall had been written, in a way, in their own DNA. Now, let's drift west again, across cold seas and misty fields, to England. The English royal family has always been a curious mix of charm, scandal, and self-inflicted chaos. But when it comes to inbreeding, they were relative amateurs compared to their continental cousins. Still, they had their moments. Consider Henry VIII, who, while not the product of inbreeding himself, did his best to ruin the gene pool anyway. Desperate for a male heir, he cycled through 6 wives and countless miscarriages, convinced the problem lay with them rather than, say, his own likely genetic issues. One of his daughters, Mary I, married her cousin, Philip II of Spain, yes, another Habsburg. The union was politically convenient and personally disastrous. The English despised him, Philip disliked the weather, and Mary endured a series of phantom pregnancies that may have been symptoms of cancer. When she died, childless, England passed to her half-sister Elizabeth, who wisely decided never to marry at all. A century later, cousin marriages were still common, especially among the Stuarts. Charles II of England, the merry monarch, had dozens of illegitimate children but none with his wife, Catherine of Braganza. His brother James married his cousin, and their descendants would later marry more cousins, because apparently no one in Europe had heard of genetic diversity. Even today, the British royal family's family tree loops neatly back on itself. Queen Elizabeth II and her husband, Prince Philip, were third cousins through Queen Victoria and second cousins once removed through Christian IX of Denmark. Which means, technically, they were doubly related. How romantic. Let's drift down now, quietly, to France. The French kings were famous for elegance, extravagance, and, occasionally, utter delusion. Take Charles VI, known as Charles the Mad. He was born in 1368, handsome and intelligent. But after a few years on the throne, he began suffering from terrifying fits of insanity. He once attacked his own knights in a frenzy, killing several before collapsing. Another time, he refused to let anyone touch him because he believed he was made of glass. Modern historians think he probably suffered from schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, but the people of his time blamed sorcery, bad air, or divine punishment. Naturally, the court's solution was to keep his cousin as regent, which led to, yes, more family infighting and more cousin marriages to unite the factions. His descendants would continue to intermarry for generations, producing a series of kings who were, on average, charmingly incompetent. By the 18th century, when Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette took the throne, France was in financial ruin, and their marriage, though not inbred by the strictest standards, was every bit as unlucky as the rest. It's strange, isn't it? How these great families, whose bloodlines stretched across continents, seemed to shrink inward, generation by generation. The more they tried to keep their power pure, the more fragile they became. You could say that Europe's royal houses were victims of their own mythology. They believed they were chosen by God, so why dilute divine blood with mere commoners? But nature, as it turns out, is not impressed by titles. And so, one by one, their children grew weaker, their empires smaller, their crowns heavier. By the time modern science arrived to explain what they'd done to themselves, it was already too late. So, as we drift toward the next part of the night, think of those grand portraits, the powdered faces, the long noses, the drooping eyes. Behind every gold frame was a family tree that curved back on itself like a snake eating its own tail. They believed they were preserving a legacy. They were really just making it delicate. Hey everyone, still awake? Or maybe you're halfway there, eyes heavy, mind drifting somewhere between a royal court and your pillow. Perfect. Let's keep it soft, keep it slow. Tonight we're visiting the kings and queens of Europe who ruled with all the grace, composure, and dignity of mildly spoiled toddlers. Because while history likes to talk about great battles and empires, most royal dramas began and ended over breathtakingly small things, hurt feelings, petty jealousies, and who got to sit closer to the fire. So, let's drift gently through the velvet halls of royal dysfunction, where divine right met fragile egos, and where the crown was often heavier than the brain beneath it. We'll start, as all good tales of pettiness should, with France. Louis XIV, the Sun King. The man who looked at a perfectly functional medieval palace in Paris and thought, "No, I want a house that's shinier." So, naturally, he built Versailles, a shimmering, gilded dream that required tens of thousands of laborers, an ocean of gold leaf, and the complete destruction of France's budget. Versailles wasn't just a palace, it was a power trap. Louis invited his nobles to live there so he could watch them at all times. He turned flattery into government policy. To get ahead at court, one had to master the delicate art of complimenting the king's calves. Every morning, Louis performed the lever du roi, the royal waking up ceremony. Picture this, a room full of courtiers silently watching as the king opens his eyes. There were ranks of privilege. Some nobles were allowed to hand him his shirt, others his shoes, and a select few might whisper a few words while he brushed his wig. It was part theater, part surveillance, and entirely ridiculous. But it worked. The nobles were so busy jockeying for permission to help the king put on his socks that they forgot to plot rebellions. Louis lived to be 76, long enough to outlast nearly all his children and grandchildren. When he died, the crowds cheered. He had ruled for 72 years, bankrupted his country, and made himself into a literal sun god. Petty? Perhaps. Effective? Also yes. Let's drift north to England again, where pettiness was practically a royal tradition. Few monarchs perfected it quite like Henry VIII, that human wrecking ball of Tudor ambition. Henry is best remembered for having 6 wives, but his real legacy was how spectacularly he managed to alienate nearly everyone he met. He started as a handsome, athletic young man, fluent in multiple languages, talented at music, and fond of jousting. But the more power he gained, the more he began to confuse divine right with being right. His first wife, Catherine of Aragon, was devoted, intelligent, and unfortunately, unable to give him a surviving son. After years of failed pregnancies, Henry decided that their marriage must have been cursed, since Catherine had previously been married to his brother. It couldn't possibly have been his fault, of course. So, naturally, he asked the Pope for an annulment. When the Pope refused, Henry's solution was simple: create an entirely new church. He declared himself head of the Church of England, confiscated monasteries, and executed anyone who disagreed. Because when you're Henry VIII, religious schism is just another form of problem solving. He then married Anne Boleyn, who gave him a daughter, Elizabeth, but no son. So he accused her of adultery and witchcraft, had her beheaded, and moved on to wife number 3. Jane Seymour gave him a son but died in childbirth. After that, Henry's marriages became increasingly desperate and ill-advised. By the time he married Anne of Cleves, he was overweight, paranoid, and perpetually in pain. Upon meeting her in person, he reportedly declared she looked like a Flanders mare. The marriage lasted 6 months. She, being the wisest of his wives, accepted an annulment and a generous pension, then spent the rest of her life far away from him. Henry died obese, ulcerated, and furious that the world had failed to meet his expectations. Which, in fairness, was how he lived most of his life. Across the Channel, France had its own answer to Henry's royal tantrums: Louis XV, the king who managed to make being bored into a national crisis. Louis XV inherited the throne as a child, adored by his people. They called him Louis the Well-Beloved. Unfortunately, that nickname aged about as well as he did. By his 30s, he had lost interest in governing and dedicated most of his energy to extracurricular activities. The king maintained an entire residence at Versailles, the Parc aux Cerfs, solely for his mistresses. Some were sophisticated courtesans, others were barely teenagers. His favorites were awarded titles, jewels, and enormous influence, much to the fury of the court. One of them, Madame de Pompadour, managed to turn her role into an art form. She was charming, witty, and, crucially, unthreatening. When her romantic relationship with the king ended, she simply transitioned into being his best friend and political advisor, because that's how efficient mistresses operated in the 18th century. By the end of his reign, Louis XV was deeply unpopular. The people whispered that he had exhausted both the treasury and the patience of God. When he died of smallpox in 1774, his body was rushed out of Versailles under cover of night to avoid angry crowds. It's said the funeral procession passed through empty streets, no tears, no prayers. Just the sound of wheels on cobblestones. Now let's drift east again, into Prussia, a place that somehow produced both the most disciplined armies and the most emotionally complicated monarchs in Europe. Frederick William I, known as the Soldier King, ruled in the early 1700s and loved two things: the army and yelling. He was famous for his temper and his obsession with tall soldiers. He collected them like other kings collected art. If he saw a particularly tall man on the street, he'd have him kidnapped and drafted into his personal regiment, known as the Potsdam Giants. His son, Frederick the Great, was everything his father wasn't: refined, artistic, and more interested in playing the flute than commanding troops. Naturally, this enraged Frederick William, who considered music a sign of weakness. Their relationship reached its breaking point when young Frederick tried to run away with a friend. The king caught them, executed the friend in front of Frederick, and kept his son imprisoned for months. It was an act of cruelty that haunted Frederick for the rest of his life. When he finally became king, Frederick channeled his trauma into relentless efficiency. He turned Prussia into a military powerhouse, built a glittering court at Sanssouci, and wrote flute sonatas between battles. But he never married, never forgave his father, and probably never slept peacefully again. So, yes, Europe's greatest soldier king was raised by a man who screamed at him for liking music. History, as always, has a dark sense of humor. Now, let's drift down to the Italian states, a patchwork of noble families who made pettiness an Olympic sport. In Renaissance Florence, the Medici family controlled everything: banking, politics, art, and occasionally, the papacy. They weren't technically monarchs, but they behaved like it. Their rivalries were legendary. When Lorenzo de' Medici, known as the Magnificent, ruled Florence, he surrounded himself with artists: Botticelli, Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci. But even his charm couldn't keep the peace. Rival families like the Pizzi decided that if they couldn't outshine the Medici, they might as well stab them. During Easter Mass in 1478, they attacked Lorenzo and his brother in the cathedral. Lorenzo survived. His brother didn't. The conspirators were hunted down and executed in imaginative ways, hung from the very windows of the government building they'd hoped to control. Florence returned to normal, by which I mean a tense, paranoid calm that lasted about 5 minutes. A century later, another branch of the Medici family produced Catherine de' Medici, who would go on to become Queen of France. She brought with her an Italian taste for poison and political scheming, and her reign saw the French wars of religion, countless assassinations, and one of the worst massacres in European history. She also allegedly kept a cabinet of perfumes that could double as lethal toxins, which may have been the Renaissance version of multitasking. And then, of course, there's the ever-dramatic story of Christian VII of Denmark, a king whose life reads like a tragic play performed entirely in whispers. Christian became king at just 17. He was charming, handsome, and profoundly unwell. Historians now believe he suffered from severe mental illness, possibly schizophrenia. He would talk to himself for hours, mutilate his body, and throw food at courtiers during dinner. His young wife, Caroline Matilda, sister to Britain's George III, was lonely and miserable. Eventually, she found comfort in the king's physician, Johann Struensee, a rationalist doctor who actually cared about human welfare. Naturally, this became both a love affair and a political revolution. Struensee used his influence over the king to push through progressive reforms, abolishing torture, improving education, and promoting freedom of the press. It was a remarkable burst of enlightenment, until the conservative nobles noticed. In 1772, Struensee was arrested, tortured, and executed. Caroline was exiled, heartbroken. The king, left alone, retreated further into madness. The country moved on without him. It's one of history's quiet tragedies, a glimpse of modernity crushed by fear and court politics. Sometimes, royal dysfunction wasn't tragic, it was simply absurd. Take Queen Christina of Sweden, who ruled in the mid-1600s. She was brilliant, eccentric, and utterly uninterested in being a queen. She wore men's clothes, refused to marry, and insisted on attending philosophical debates instead of council meetings. One day, she simply announced she was abdicating. She converted to Catholicism, a scandal for Protestant Sweden, and moved to Rome, where she spent her days collecting art, attending plays, and terrifying the Pope with her frank opinions. Christina was, in many ways, centuries ahead of her time, an intellectual trapped in a world of ceremonial nonsense. But to her courtiers, she was just another royal oddity to be endured politely until she left. And finally, let's drift into one last royal disaster, George IV of England, a man who could have been charming if he hadn't been so thoroughly in love with himself. George was a connoisseur of excess. He adored fine clothes, expensive art, and lavish architecture. He built Brighton Pavilion, a palace that looks like an Indian temple crossed with a wedding cake, and redecorated every room in Buckingham Palace because, as he said, the furniture looked sad. He also managed to make his marriage a national scandal. Forced to wed Princess Caroline of Brunswick, he found her so repulsive that he refused to live with her. Their mutual loathing became legendary. When she returned to England years later, the king tried to have her banned from his coronation. The public, sensing the pettiness, immediately took her side. When she was denied entry to Westminster Abbey, the crowd rioted. George eventually got his crown, but his popularity never recovered. He died bloated, indebted, and surrounded by luxury he could no longer enjoy. His only real achievement was proving that monarchy could, in fact, be too much of a good thing. So, as we drift deeper into the night, think of these kings and queens, petty, passionate, and painfully human. Their thrones were grand, their crowns heavy, and their tempers remarkably small. They remind us that history isn't just wars and treaties. It's also arguments about etiquette, misplaced jealousy, and the eternal royal habit of making everything about themselves. In the end, all that gold and ceremony couldn't disguise a simple truth: power magnifies personality. And when that personality is fragile, history tends to remember. Let's rest here for a moment, breathe, and drift onward. Hey everyone, still awake? If you've made it this far into our little time travel experiment, congratulations. You've successfully navigated the questionable smells, survived the ale, avoided bathing in plague water, and you've possibly even spoken to a medieval person without accidentally starting a small theological crisis. But tonight, as we drift into the quieter corners of the 14th century, we're going to focus on something very important. Something you'll need if you plan to stay in medieval Europe longer than, say, 10 minutes. How not to die. Because statistically speaking, you will. In fact, if you're lucky enough to be alive in the Middle Ages, the world itself seems personally invested in correcting that error. Disease, famine, superstition, war, weather, wild animals, every element of nature and human society seems determined to make sure you don't make it to your next birthday. So tonight, let's gently float through the perils of survival in the medieval world. And the many, many ways you might meet an untimely end. Food, glorious, occasionally deadly food. Let's start with the thing you'll be doing at least once a day if you're very, very fortunate: eating. Now, if you come from the 21st century, you're used to choices. You can have sushi, tacos, a vegan burger that tastes like sadness and moral superiority, or perhaps a latte that costs the same as a medieval chicken. But if you're dining in medieval Europe, your options are simpler. They range from bread to bread, but slightly moldy. For peasants, bread is life. It's made from rye, barley, or oats, whatever you can grow without collapsing from hunger. Sometimes it's padded with ground-up beans, or even sawdust. Yes, really. the phrase "you are what you eat" feels a bit cruel here. Wheat bread, soft and white, is for the wealthy. Because of course it is. If it looks expensive and easy to digest, nobles are already hoarding it. Butter and cheese exist, but in moderation. Meat? Occasionally. Mostly salted pork or the odd unfortunate chicken. You might get lucky during a feast, but on normal days, peasants mostly ate whatever didn't immediately run away. And here's a fun fact: most medieval food poisoning came not from spoiled food, people had impressive guts, but from flour tainted by ergot, a fungus that caused hallucinations, gangrene, and convulsions. So if your medieval friends are writhing on the floor and shouting about demons, don't worry, it's probably just bread, water, ale, and liquid regret. Now, about drinking water, don't. Just don't. Most rivers and wells in medieval towns are full of things you'd rather not think about at bedtime. Runoff from slaughterhouses, human waste, dead rats, it's all there. If you drink from it, congratulations, you've just invented dysentery. Instead, everyone, men, women, children, monks, drank ale. Weak ale, mostly, called small beer. It had low alcohol content, just enough to kill bacteria but not enough to kill your productivity. So when you see images of medieval peasants constantly drinking, it's not debauchery. It's survival. They were basically hydrated through barley. If you're of higher status, you'll have wine. Imported if you're rich, homemade and questionable if you're not. Either way, don't ask about preservatives. You don't want to know. Hygiene, or the art of pretending to be clean. Now, contrary to popular myth, medieval people didn't all smell like despair and onions. They did wash, just not every day. Bathhouses were common in cities, especially before the Black Death made everyone suspicious of water and public nudity. People bathed in large wooden tubs, often with herbs and oils. And yes, sometimes with company. Bathing was social, even romantic. Imagine a candlelit room full of steam, laughter, and people who all share one bar of soap. Monks bathed about once a week. Peasants, when they could. And nobles often doused themselves in rose water instead of actually removing dirt. If you're visiting, try not to gag, it's impolite. But here's the irony: while people thought dirt might protect them from disease, in reality, it was the perfect delivery system for it. Still, their intentions were good. They just didn't have microscopes yet. Fashionably ill-protected. You might think armor makes you invincible. It doesn't. It just turns you into a slow, overheated tin can. Chainmail was heavy, plate armor heavier, and even with all that metal, a determined spear could find the weak spot. Knights trained for years to wear it gracefully. You, a time traveler, will waddle like a penguin made of anxiety. For ordinary folk, clothing is simpler. Linen shirts, wool tunics, hose, and cloaks. Color shows class: rich folk wear bright dyes, poor folk wear mud. And shoes? Mostly leather, sometimes wooden soles. If you walk too far, congratulations, you've just invented blisters. In winter, everyone freezes. There's no central heating, only fireplaces, smoky air, and the faint hope of surviving until spring. Medical advice you shouldn't take. If you catch a cold, try not to mention it. Because if you do, someone will insist on bleeding you. Medieval medicine is based on the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If you're sick, it means one of them is out of balance. The solution? Remove some blood, or perhaps add leeches. Doctors, if you can afford one, will prescribe mixtures of herbs, crushed pearls, or, for the truly unlucky, mercury. Barbers double as surgeons. They'll pull teeth, lance boils, and occasionally amputate limbs. All with the same tools they use for haircuts. Hospitals exist, mostly run by monasteries, but they're less about healing and more about spiritual care. You go there to die with dignity, not to recover. So the best health advice for time travelers? Avoid injuries. Avoid childbirth. Avoid existing. Social etiquette: How to not get burned as a witch. You'll want to fit in socially, too. That means minding your manners, especially around nobles, clergy, and anyone with a sword. Bowing is safe. Speaking too confidently is not. And for heaven's sake, don't talk about science, hygiene, or the earth being round. That's how people end up on pyres. Religion saturates every moment of daily life. The church dictates everything: when you eat, when you fast, what you wear, what you think. If you seem too curious or skeptical, people will start whispering words like heretic. If you're a woman and you talk too much about herbs, you'll be accused of witchcraft. It's best to nod, smile softly, and keep your opinions about evolution to yourself. Wildlife and other perils. Medieval Europe is full of creatures that look cute in manuscripts but terrifying in reality. Wolves still roam the forests. Bears too, depending on the century. Boars are aggressive and occasionally fatal. Even cows can kill you if you stand in the wrong spot. Dogs are useful for guarding and herding, but don't expect cuddly golden retrievers. Medieval dogs are scrappy survivors, more likely to steal your dinner than fetch it. Rats, however, are everywhere. And where there are rats, there are fleas. And where there are fleas, there is plague. We'll drift into that particular horror later. For now, just know that in the Middle Ages, nature is both beautiful and mildly homicidal. The Black Death, a gentle, awful interlude. Let's take a quiet moment to discuss the single most efficient population control method in European history, the Black Death. It arrived in the 1340s, carried by fleas on rats. Within a few years, it killed somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population. Entire villages vanished. Fields went untended. Cities reeked of despair. If you're traveling through this period, keep your distance from any place with carts full of bodies and monks singing psalms. Also, avoid doctors wearing those long-beaked masks. They look impressive but knew very little. Their masks were stuffed with herbs, because, naturally, they believed nice smells could ward off disease. If you want to survive, your best option is isolation. Find a quiet monastery. Pretend to be a monk. Read the Psalms, drink the ale, and stay far away from other humans. Which, honestly, isn't terrible advice in any century. Survival summary. So, let's recap. Don't drink the water. Don't eat the ergot bread. Don't bleed yourself to cure a cold. Don't say the earth is round. And whatever you do, don't pet the rat. Do that, and you might just survive your time in medieval Europe long enough to return home, preferably after inventing soap and quietly improving everyone's life expectancy. And as we slowly close this part of our medieval night, imagine yourself standing at the edge of a medieval field. The air is cold and full of wood smoke. In the distance, a church bell tolls the hour. You've survived another day without plague, famine, or leeches. Congratulations. Now, let's drift gently onward. Because our next stop will take us to the strange, glittering world of medieval royalty, where the real dangers often came not from disease or famine, but from your own family. Hey everyone, still here? If you've survived medieval life as a peasant, first of all, congratulations. You've avoided dysentery, ergot poisoning, and spontaneous accusations of witchcraft. That's a pretty good start. But maybe you're ready for an upgrade. Maybe you've looked around at the muddy fields, the endless chores, and thought, you know what? I'd rather have silk sheets, servants, and gout. Excellent. You're ready to try being royal. Tonight, we're drifting through the dangerous, dazzling, and deeply dysfunctional world of medieval royalty. A world where your biggest threat isn't starvation, it's your relatives. Where your entire life is planned before you're even born. And where being too healthy, too handsome, or too ambitious could get you quietly poisoned before supper. So, tuck yourself in. Pour another imaginary goblet of wine. And let's talk about how to survive life inside the royal family. Step 1. Be born correctly. As any medieval noble will tell you, birth is destiny. You can't become royal, you have to be born into it. and preferably, born male. If you're a daughter, your life will mostly revolve around making alliances and looking slightly decorative in portraits. If you're a son, congratulations, you're now an heir, a symbol of dynastic continuity, and, more importantly, a potential problem for everyone else. Royal births were public events. When a queen went into labor, half the court would be in the room to make sure the child was legitimate. Privacy wasn't a thing. Modesty wasn't a thing. And epidurals, well, definitely not a thing. If you survived infancy, which, statistically, you might not, you'd be raised by a small army of servants and tutors, taught languages, manners, and most importantly, how not to offend the church. By the time you're 6, people already have opinions about your potential. By the time you're 12, you're probably betrothed. By 16, you might already be ruling something, because your father either died of infection or was inconveniently murdered. Step 2, look like a royal, but not too healthy. Appearance mattered. You were expected to look majestic, dignified, and mildly undernourished. Medieval nobles prized pale skin. It showed you didn't work in the sun like peasants. So people powdered their faces with lead-based makeup, because of course they did. A little light poisoning was a small price for fashion. Hair was equally symbolic. Kings often grew long hair as a sign of divine authority, while queens braided theirs into intricate styles that took servants hours to complete. If you were bald, that was fine too, just wear a jeweled hat. Preferably one that says God wanted me to have this much power. As for body shape, plumpness was in. It meant wealth. Thin people were either monks or about to die. And while portraits today show kings as noble and statuesque, the reality was often less inspiring. Charles II of Spain, for example, was so inbred that he could barely chew, walk, or speak clearly. He looked less like a ruler and more like a wax figure that had started to melt. But he was royal, and that was all that mattered. Step 3, marriage is geopolitical chess. Now, let's talk about marriage. In theory, it's about love. In medieval reality, it's about land. Royal marriages were business deals disguised as ceremonies. Each one was an attempt to gain territory, seal peace, or produce heirs with the right kind of blood. Preferably, blood that wasn't already 90% related to your own. But that was rare. Europe's royal families were so intertwined that by the 16th century, most of them were cousins several times over. The Habsburgs, for instance, took this to an art form. They married within their own dynasty for so many generations that their family tree looked less like a tree and more like a tangled shrub. The result? A genetic masterpiece known as the Habsburg jaw. A magnificent chin so prominent it deserved its own postal code. By the time Charles II came along, he was the tragic punchline of centuries of dynastic enthusiasm. His autopsy revealed he had the physical condition of a man twice his age, and his family line ended with him, because, naturally, the gene pool had become more like a gene puddle. So, if you find yourself at a medieval court and someone suggests you marry your cousin, maybe don't. Tell them you've taken a vow of solitude. Or feign consumption. It'll save you a lifetime of tragic portraits. Step 4, navigating the court. Royal courts were the original reality shows, full of gossip, scheming, and passive-aggressive banquets. Every gesture was political. Every smile could mean betrayal. Your courtiers will flatter you to your face and plot against you by candlelight. They'll compete for your attention, your gold, and, if you're a king, possibly your affection. Loyalty in court is like perfume, it smells pleasant, but it doesn't last long. So, if you're planning to survive, you'll need to master the art of polite paranoia. Don't trust your cousins, they want your throne. Don't trust your in-laws, they want revenge. And definitely don't trust your servants, they hear everything. Kings like Henry VIII understood this perfectly. He ruled through fear, charm, and occasional executions. His version of unfriending someone was slightly more permanent. Still, even paranoid kings weren't safe. Court politics could turn deadly in an instant. Poison was the weapon of choice, quiet, elegant, and hard to prove. especially when everyone already looked pale and unwell to begin with. So if your wine tastes funny, maybe skip dessert. Step 5. The perils of parenthood. If you're lucky enough to have children, congratulations, you've just created new potential heirs, rivals, and hostages all in one go. Royal families treated offspring less like loved ones and more like chess pieces. Daughters were married off as early as 12 to secure alliances. Sons were sent to govern distant lands or command armies before they could grow a decent beard. And if you had too many sons, well, things could get awkward. 1 heir is necessary. 2 is risky. 3 means civil war. Just ask Henry II of England, whose sons spent years rebelling against him while he was still alive. Or the Ottoman sultans, who decided to skip the problem entirely by instituting fratricide, where a new sultan was expected to execute his brothers upon taking the throne. A grim solution, yes, but undeniably efficient. The medieval concept of family bonding was complicated. Step 6. Staying on the throne, and keeping your head. Once you're king or queen, the real challenge begins, staying there. Because being crowned doesn't guarantee survival, it just paints a target on your back in gold leaf. Your rule depends on keeping your nobles content, your peasants quiet, and your clergy convinced that God still likes you. Fail any of those, and you'll end up in a dungeon, a monastery, or a very decorative coffin. Medieval monarchs were constantly being deposed, assassinated, or accidentally falling out of windows. Richard II of England was starved to death in prison. Edward II was murdered under unpleasant circumstances involving a poker. And poor Charles the Mad of France ruled while convinced he was made of glass. To survive as a monarch, you had to appear both divine and human. Strong enough to rule, gentle enough to seem merciful, and unstable enough that no one dared test you. It's a fine balance, one many failed to master. Step 7. The royal diet of power and regret. Let's talk food again, but royal this time. While peasants were gnawing on barley loaves, kings and queens dined on roasted swan, venison, peacocks, and elaborate pastries shaped like mythical creatures. It sounds glamorous until you realize none of it was balanced or remotely healthy. Their meals were heavy on meat and sugar, light on vegetables, and seasoned with wealth. The result? A nation's worth of monarchs suffering from gout, a condition so common it was nicknamed the king's disease. They'd limp through their palaces, feasting on more of the thing that made them ill, because moderation wasn't invented until the 18th century. So if you're joining the royal table, maybe pace yourself. Take a little stew, skip the swan, and under no circumstances eat anything blue. It's probably been sitting out since the Crusades. Step 8. Legacy, or the art of being remembered poorly. Finally, every monarch's nightmare, the history books. Because no matter how powerful you were, someone, someday, will summarize your life in a single unflattering sentence. Charles the Bald. Ethelred the Unready. Louis the Sluggard. These were actual kings. Imagine ruling a kingdom for decades, only to be remembered as Ethelred the Unready. Even great rulers weren't safe from ironic nicknames. William the Conqueror was also called the Bastard. Richard the Lionheart was rarely in England. And Ivan the Terrible, well, that one speaks for itself. If you're lucky, you'll be remembered for your architecture, or your wars, or your extensive collection of questionable tapestries. If you're unlucky, you'll be remembered as a footnote, or worse, a punchline on a sleepy YouTube channel. So, if you find yourself in medieval Europe with a crown on your head, remember this. It's not the peasants you have to fear, it's your family, your courtiers, and your own questionable genetics. Stay polite, stay paranoid, and never, ever attend a banquet without watching who pours your wine. And as the candles in the royal hall flicker low, imagine the court quieting for the night. Velvet drapes whisper against the stone. Outside, the torches sputter in the wind. You're still alive, still powerful, and still ever so slightly terrified. Let's drift onward. Because in our next part, we'll step behind the throne, to the royal servants, jesters, and mistresses who made life at court even more interesting. Hey everyone, welcome back. By now, you've survived the peasants' mud, the plague's mood swings, and the royal family's inbreeding. You've officially earned a promotion to the royal household. Tonight, we're slipping quietly through the back corridors of medieval palaces. The places no chronicler ever wrote about, but where most of the real work and gossip actually happened. The life of a royal servant was part soap opera, part survival training. These were the people who dressed the kings, spoon-fed the queens, fetched water for baths, and occasionally buried the evidence of royal misbehavior. They lived in the constant shadow of grandeur and the occasional risk of being executed for knowing too much. So settle in. Let's drift softly behind the throne and meet the forgotten souls who kept the whole ridiculous royal machine running. The servants who saw everything. Let's start with the unsung backbone of every castle, the servants. From the outside, a medieval palace looks like a monument to elegance, marble floors, silk curtains, golden plates. But behind the scenes? It's chaos. Hundreds of staff lived, worked, and gossiped in these corridors. There were cooks, laundresses, pages, squires, scribes, stable boys, wet nurses, jesters, cupbearers, and at least one guy whose sole job was to hold candles near people's faces. The higher your status, the more servants you had, and the less privacy you enjoyed. A queen could barely sneeze without 3 attendants rushing to document it. And then there were the truly intimate servants, the ones who dressed their monarchs, brushed their hair, and, yes, helped them with the less glamorous aspects of daily life. Which brings us to one of history's most underappreciated jobs. The groom of the stool, the most trusted bottom in history. Yes, that's the real title. The groom of the stool was a royal attendant whose job, brace yourself, was to assist the king during his most private moments. And I mean assist in the most literal sense. He managed the royal toilet, or closed stool, handed the monarch towels, and occasionally, cleaned up after him. It was considered a position of incredible trust, since this servant had access to the king's most private thoughts and functions. As strange as it sounds, this wasn't a humiliating role, it was prestigious. Because the closer you were to the king's body, the closer you were to power. Grooms of the stool became confidants, advisors, and even political influencers. After all, no one interrupts the man who controls your chamber pot. During Henry VIII's reign, the groom of the stool was arguably more powerful than many nobles. Because when the king spends half his life feasting and the other half regretting it, that's a man who values reliable help. So if you ever find yourself employed in a Tudor palace, don't be too quick to laugh at the title. You might literally hold the key to the throne. The royal kitchens, culinary warfare. Down below, in the roaring, smoky underbelly of the castle, the royal kitchens never slept. Massive hearths, open flames, and the smell of roasting meat filled the air. It was less like fine dining and more like a battlefield with soup. The cooks had to prepare enough food to feed hundreds of courtiers every day. And since refrigeration hadn't been invented yet, fresh meant not obviously moving. Cooks were masters of disguise, especially when it came to leftovers. Yesterday's goose could become today's pie. Spoiled meat? Cover it in spices and hope for the best. Medieval banquets were lavish but terrifying affairs. Whole animals, boars, swans, even porcupines, were roasted and reassembled to look alive. Presentation mattered more than digestion. And of course, the risk of poisoning loomed over every platter. Tasters were employed to sample dishes before the royals did. It was a prestigious position, though somewhat short-lived. So if you're in the kitchen, keep your head down, stir quietly, and never taste anything unless someone else is first. The maids and mistresses. Now let's wander upstairs, where the air smells faintly of perfume and intrigue. In royal courts, the queen's ladies-in-waiting were more than just assistants, they were her confidants, companions, and sometimes pawns. They helped her dress, read her letters aloud, and listened patiently as she complained about her arranged marriage to a man she barely knew. Many of these women were from noble families, sent to court as political offerings. They gained status, gossip, and sometimes, attention from the king. Which brings us, naturally, to mistresses. Royal mistresses were not just lovers, they were unofficial advisors, power brokers, and sometimes scapegoats. Kings, after all, were rarely faithful. They considered monogamy more of a polite suggestion. Mistresses could rise from obscurity to immense influence. Agnes Sorel, for example, became the first officially recognized royal mistress of France in the 15th century. She was beautiful, ambitious, and wore gowns so low-cut that priests publicly denounced her. The king, however, adored her and built her a private chapel, which feels like a mixed message. But the higher you climbed, the more dangerous it became. A royal mistress who fell from favor could be banished, imprisoned, or quietly poisoned. Because nothing says the romance is over quite like political assassination. The jesters and fools. Now, let's lighten the mood, slightly, with the one person in court who could technically insult the king and live to tell about it, the court jester. Jesters were entertainers, comedians, and occasionally, truth-tellers. They wore bright costumes, jingling bells, and a perpetual smile that probably hid an ocean of despair. Their job was to amuse the court, singing, storytelling, juggling, and sometimes delivering biting political satire disguised as nonsense. A good jester could say what no one else dared to. A bad jester was quickly replaced. Some jesters became legendary. Will Sommers, for example, served Henry VIII for years and was one of the few people who could calm the king's infamous temper. He outlived several of Henry's wives, which, statistically speaking, was an achievement. But being a jester was risky. One wrong joke, and you'd find yourself unemployed, or in pieces. So if you're planning to audition for the role, remember, timing is everything, and treason is not a punchline. The spies in the shadows. Every royal household had its spies. They listened behind doors, read intercepted letters, and reported every whispered secret to someone higher up. Servants were the perfect spies. They blended in, moved quietly, and knew everyone's habits. In Tudor England, for instance, even the laundrymaids might have been informants. And in France, Louis XIV's palace at Versailles was practically a stage play performed entirely for surveillance. If you said the wrong thing near the wrong person, it might reach the king by morning. So court life wasn't just about luxury, it was about constant performance. Every smile, every word, every glance could be recorded, misinterpreted, and used against you. In that sense, medieval palaces weren't so different from social media. Except that deleting your mistakes usually involved a guillotine. When servants became legends. Every so often, a servant rose above their station, usually by luck, charm, or sheer cunning. Thomas Wolsey started as the son of a butcher and ended up as cardinal and chief advisor to Henry VIII. He built palaces, amassed wealth, and almost ruled England in all but name. Until, of course, Henry got bored and ruined him. Jean Becu, better known as Madame du Barry, was born poor and became the mistress of King Louis XV of France. She was charming, extravagant, and fatally bad at politics. When the French Revolution came knocking, she didn't last long. The moral? In royal courts, fortune rises quickly and falls even faster. Today's confidant is tomorrow's prisoner. And the only safe position is probably cleaning the floors. No one ever beheaded a janitor. Behind the glamour. When we picture royal life, we imagine glittering halls, dancing candles, and elegant feasts. But behind those scenes were hundreds of exhausted servants, working by torchlight, scrubbing, sewing, polishing, and praying not to be noticed. They slept in cramped rooms, woke before dawn, and lived on scraps of the royal leftovers. They saw everything, the cruelty, the hypocrisy, the fleeting kindnesses, and they kept it all to themselves. Because in a world where gossip could kill, silence was the ultimate survival skill. And as we drift away from the bustling corridors and into the quiet night beyond the castle walls, picture the torches burning low, the kitchens finally cooling, and the servants asleep in the straw. Their dreams are simple: warmth, safety, a day without shouting. The royals, meanwhile, dream of power. Both kinds of people are probably disappointed in the morning. Let's drift onward. Because next, We'll wander out of the castle gates and into the medieval towns, the markets, the streets, the noise, and the fascinating chaos of ordinary life. Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're still with me, congratulations, you've officially made it through the castle gates. You've seen the kings, the servants, the absurd amount of velvet. Now it's time to take a quiet stroll into the real world. Tonight, we're wandering through the streets of medieval Europe. Not the romanticized version from storybooks, the real one. The one that smelled less than poetic. So take a slow breath. Not too deep, though. The medieval city was many things, busy, colorful, fascinating, but fresh was not one of them. The soundtrack of the Middle Ages. Cities back then were noisy. Not the steady hum of cars or the chatter of cafes, but an irregular, human noise. Hammering, bells, carts creaking, dogs barking, chickens protesting, babies crying. Someone's yelling about bread prices, someone else is playing a lute terribly. Morning began not with an alarm clock but with church bells, roosters, and your neighbor dumping waste into the street. Because yes, that was a thing. The medieval sewage system was, shall we say, very direct. If you lived in London, Paris, or Florence, you'd walk on cobblestones covered in a fragrant mix of hay, mud, horse dung, and whatever people emptied from their chamber pots the night before. And it was all perfectly normal. People even had specific times for waste disposal, usually after dark. It was called the night soil hour. Which sounds romantic until you realize it wasn't. So as you walk through a medieval town, try not to step in anything that moves. Markets, where chaos met commerce. The medieval market was the beating heart of the city. It was loud, crowded, and oddly theatrical. Merchants shouted over each other, hawking everything from meat to fabric to dubious miracle tonics. There were butchers carving on open tables, bakers pulling bread from smoky ovens, and fishmongers announcing their wares with the enthusiasm of auctioneers. You could buy spices from the east, furs from Russia, or a live goose tied neatly with string. You could also have your pocket picked before you finished haggling. Markets weren't just for buying goods, they were for news, gossip, and entertainment. Street performers sang, jugglers showed off, and the occasional preacher yelled about sin. It was part shopping mall, part festival, part public argument. And of course, everything had a smell: fish, sweat, cheese, and humanity. If you could tolerate the odor, you could find almost anything. Guilds, craftsmen, and people who took their jobs very seriously. Beneath the shouting and chaos, there was structure. Tradesmen belonged to guilds, powerful organizations that regulated everything from prices to quality to who could open a shop. If you were a blacksmith, you joined the Blacksmiths' Guild. If you were a baker, you joined the bakers. If you made shoes, barrels, candles, or musical instruments, there was a guild for you. Guilds protected members from competition and gave them social status. But they also enforced strict hierarchies. You started as an apprentice, then became a journeyman, and only after years of work, and possibly several burned fingers, could you call yourself a master. A master craftsman could hang a sign, take apprentices, and join the city council. Everyone else kept their head down and hoped for fair wages. So, if you time travel to medieval Europe and find yourself unemployed, your best option might be to apprentice yourself to a trade. Just don't expect weekends, safety gear, or dental care. Taverns and alehouses, the medieval living room. After a long day of work or shouting at people in the market, the medieval citizen needed to relax. And there was no better place for that than the local tavern. Taverns were the center of social life. People drank ale, played dice, told stories, and occasionally started brawls over card games that no one understood. They were smoky, dimly lit, and full of noise. But they were also democratic. Everyone, from peasants to minor nobles, might end up at the same sticky wooden table. Alcohol was practically a health drink in the Middle Ages. Water was risky, but ale was boiled during brewing, which made it safer. So even children drank it, though theirs was a weaker version called small beer. If you wanted something stronger, there was wine, if you were rich, or mead, if you were lucky enough to have honey. Drunkenness was common, but mostly tolerated. Unless you insulted someone important. Then it became public disorder, and the town guard would haul you off. Still, for many people, taverns were the only places where life felt bearable, where laughter could drown out hardship for an evening. Public punishment, entertainment, but make it legal. Let's drift over to the town square, where justice was, unfortunately, a spectator sport. In the absence of Netflix, people found other ways to stay entertained. Executions, floggings, and public humiliations drew huge crowds. The pillory and the stocks were common fixtures, simple wooden frames that trapped your head and hands. If you were caught stealing, cheating, or gossiping about the mayor's wife, you might spend a few hours locked up while townsfolk threw things at you. Rotten fruit if you were lucky. Stones if you weren't. It wasn't all cruelty, at least not intentionally. Punishments were meant to teach lessons in full view of the community. But, of course, people mostly came for the show. Even executions had a carnival atmosphere. Vendors sold snacks. Children sat on shoulders for a better view. It was grim, yes, but also disturbingly normal. If you ever time travel to the medieval square, it's best to watch quietly from the back. And maybe pretend to look deeply pious. The smells and sounds after dark. When the sun set, medieval cities changed character. The noise quieted, but the danger increased. There were no streetlights, just a few torches flickering outside inns or churches. Most people stayed indoors after dark. Thieves prowled the alleys, and the occasional drunk wandered home singing to himself. The night watch patrolled with lanterns, calling out the hours. If you were caught outside without reason, you might be questioned, or mugged. But for some, night was when work began. Bakers started their ovens, night soil collectors hauled waste away, and women in certain professions stood discreetly near taverns. The city never fully slept, it just murmured more softly. So if you're strolling through medieval streets after midnight, keep your hood up, your purse close, and your expectations low. Festivals, fairs, and days off that weren't really off. For all its hardships, medieval life did have joy, especially during festivals. Religious holidays filled the calendar. Feast days, saints' days, harvest fairs, every excuse for a celebration was taken. People dressed in their best clothes, sang songs, danced in the streets, and forgot, for a moment, that they owed taxes to 6 different people. There were jugglers, puppet shows, contests, and, because this was still the Middle Ages, occasional animal fights. Some festivals were deeply religious. Others were barely disguised parties. Carnival season, for example, was famous for masks, drinking, and general chaos. Rules loosened. Servants mocked their masters. The world turned upside down for a day, and then back again. And then everyone went back to work. Medieval medicine, just don't ask too many questions. No discussion of medieval street life would be complete without mentioning the neighborhood healer, or, if you were unlucky, the barber surgeon. Medicine was experimental. Doctors believed in balancing bodily humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If you were ill, they might bleed you with leeches, make you sniff herbs, or prescribe something that smelled like it came from the sewer. Pharmacists, known as apothecaries, mixed powders and potions with impressive confidence. Did they work? Occasionally. But even if they didn't, the placebo effect and faith did wonders. For anything more serious, there was always the church. Prayer, pilgrimages, and relics were the spiritual equivalent of antibiotics. And sometimes, they worked about as well. The rhythm of ordinary life. Despite the filth, danger, and occasional riot, medieval cities had a rhythm, a comforting predictability. The bells marked time. Markets came and went. Children played in courtyards, apprentices joked in workshops, and old women sold herbs at street corners. People didn't think of themselves as living in the Middle Ages. They were simply living, working, laughing, arguing, surviving. And in their own way, they built the foundations of the modern world, one uneven cobblestone at a time. So as we drift away from the noise of the marketplace, let's imagine the streets emptying, shutters closing, the faint glow of candles in the windows. Someone hums a tune. Somewhere, a dog barks once and falls silent. The medieval city settles into uneasy sleep. And so do we. Let's drift onward. Because next, we're heading into the realm of faith, relics, and holy absurdity, the world of medieval religion, pilgrimages, and miracles that probably weren't. Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight, we're lighting a single candle and stepping softly into one of the strangest, most powerful parts of medieval life, religion. Faith was the heartbeat of the Middle Ages. It was everywhere, in everything. It shaped laws, crowned kings, justified wars, and dictated what you could eat on a Wednesday. But it was also a business. A deeply sincere, occasionally manipulative, and often absurd business. So settle in. Let's drift quietly through monasteries, cathedrals, and pilgrim roads. Let's meet the holy men who prayed all day, the merchants who sold salvation by the pound, and the believers who collected enough relics to fill a small museum of bones. Faith is the framework of life. To live in medieval Europe was to live under the shadow and comfort of the church. From birth to death, every milestone came with ritual and blessing. You were baptized before you could walk, confessed before you could sin properly, married under the eyes of God, and buried beneath his watchful gaze. Even time itself revolved around faith. The year wasn't divided just by months, but by feast days and fasts. You didn't say, "It's July," you said, "It's the feast of Saint Swithin," who, incidentally, was believed to control the weather, because of course he was. The church was everywhere, the tallest building in every town, the echoing voice in every square, the keeper of both your soul and your secrets. And for many, that was a comfort. In a world of plagues and wars and unpredictable rulers, faith was the one constant that didn't change its mind overnight. Monks, the quiet ones who controlled everything. Let's start in the monasteries. Peaceful, silent, filled with the scent of candle wax and parchment. Monks prayed, copied manuscripts, and tended gardens. At least, that's the image most people have. In truth, monasteries were also centers of wealth, land ownership, and surprisingly good wine production. Monks weren't supposed to be rich, but somehow they often were. It turns out when everyone donates land for the good of their soul, it adds up. Daily life in a monastery followed a strict routine. Prayers before dawn. Chanting, reading, copying texts, working the fields. And silence, lots of silence. Because talking was seen as a distraction from God, though the creative use of hand gestures suggests humans have always found loopholes. Some monks became genuine scholars. Others spent their days illuminating manuscripts so intricately that the letters looked like they'd been drawn by elves. And a few, inevitably, complained about everything in the margins. Brother Matthew snores too loudly, reads one surviving note. Truly timeless. Pilgrimages, the original road trips. Now, imagine you're a medieval Christian and feeling a bit spiritually underwhelmed. Maybe you've sinned. Maybe you're just bored. The solution? A pilgrimage. Pilgrimages were journeys to holy sites, shrines, relics, or miracle locations. They could be short walks to a nearby abbey, or grueling treks across continents to places like Rome, Santiago de Compostela, or Jerusalem. Traveling on foot for hundreds of miles was seen as an act of devotion and penance. It was also a convenient way to see the world and escape your landlord for a few weeks. Pilgrims wore special badges to show where they were headed, tiny lead tokens shaped like scallop shells or saints. They carried staffs, wore wide hats, and often joined groups for safety. Along the way, they stayed in inns, monasteries, or the occasional charitable hospital, though hospital meant something closer to barn with good intentions. By the time they reached their destination, most pilgrims were tired, hungry, and spiritually enlightened mostly by the relief of being done. Relics, holy souvenirs with questionable provenance. And what awaited many pilgrims at their destination? Relics. Bones, teeth, scraps of cloth, bits of wood, anything allegedly connected to a saint or a miracle. relics were the spiritual currency of the Middle Ages. Owning one could make a town famous, draw pilgrims, and, most importantly, generate income. And the claims were spectacular. By the 13th century, Europe had enough fragments of the true cross to build several ships. At least 3 heads of John the Baptist. And more saintly fingers than there were saints to account for them. Were they all genuine? Of course not. But faith isn't about proof, it's about belief. And if a fragment of bone gave someone hope, who was going to argue? Churches built elaborate reliquaries, golden containers encrusted with jewels, to display their treasures. Pilgrims would kneel, pray, and sometimes pay a small fee for the privilege of being near them. And the church quietly smiled all the way to the donation box. It wasn't exactly fraud. It was marketing. Spiritual capitalism, centuries before the term existed. Miracles in the business of the divine. Miracles were another essential part of the faith economy. They were divine endorsements, proof that God, or at least a saint, was paying attention. Some were subtle, a healing, a vision, a sudden recovery. Others were dramatic, statues weeping, relics glowing, or corpses refusing to decompose. The church investigated these claims, occasionally. But mostly, miracles spread by rumor. If enough people believed it happened, then it happened. And miracles meant pilgrims. Pilgrims meant donations. Donations meant new chapels, fresher candles, and maybe a new abbot with suspiciously nice robes. Of course, the line between faith and theater was thin. In 14th century France, one church claimed their statue of the Virgin Mary physically turned her head during prayers. It turned out the local sexton had installed a clever pulley system. Faith, meet engineering. Still, people came. Because whether or not the miracle was real, the hope it gave them was. The confession economy. Let's drift over to the quieter corner of the cathedral, the confessional. Where guilt meets bureaucracy. Confession was essential. You told the priest your sins, received absolution, and performed whatever penance was assigned. Usually fasting, prayer, or paying a small fine if your sin involved property damage or someone's livestock. But over time, confession got complicated. People wanted quicker forgiveness. And the church, ever adaptable, found a solution: indulgences. An indulgence was like a spiritual coupon. Donate to the church, go on a crusade, fund a chapel, or simply buy the indulgence outright, and your time in purgatory was reduced. It was meant as a reward for good deeds, but quickly became a system where the rich could effectively prepay their way to heaven. By the late Middle Ages, indulgences were being sold in marketplaces, advertised by friars with the enthusiasm of traveling salesmen. Step right up, save your soul, limited time offer. Eventually, this got out of hand. And when one German monk named Martin Luther finally said, "Maybe this is a bit much," well, that kicked off an entire reformation. But that's another bedtime story. Holy wars, unholy motives. The church didn't just manage souls, it managed armies. The Crusades were, in theory, wars of faith. In practice, they were a messy mix of religion, politics, and opportunism. Knights marched east under holy banners, seeking salvation, glory, and occasionally free land. Popes promised forgiveness of sins for those who fought. Merchants sold supplies. And everyone else suffered. For ordinary people, the Crusades were distant events, talked about in sermons and songs. But their effects were enormous, shaping trade, politics, and the way Europe saw itself for centuries. The irony, of course, is that these holy wars often involved the same kind of greed and brutality the church preached against. But that was medieval logic for you: sin, confess, repeat. Heretics, witches, and people who asked too many questions. Not everyone agreed with church authority. And disagreement, in those days, was dangerous. Heretics, people who interpreted scripture differently, were hunted down. The Inquisition emerged as a formal way to question, judge, and occasionally execute dissenters. Because nothing says we value truth quite like a good bonfire. Women accused of witchcraft faced even harsher scrutiny. Most were just healers or midwives with local knowledge of herbs. But fear and superstition were powerful tools. When crops failed or livestock died, someone had to be blamed. Faith in the Middle Ages was sincere, but it could also be weaponized. A comfort for the fearful, and a weapon for the powerful. The quiet faith of ordinary people. For most, though, faith wasn't about relics or crusades. It was personal. Simple. Every day. People prayed for good weather, for healthy children, for safe childbirth, for mercy on the souls of the dead. They lit candles for loved ones, carved crosses above their doorways, and whispered psalms at night. Their world was uncertain, their lives fragile. Faith was the one steady thread that gave it meaning. And that, more than anything, kept the whole medieval world turning. So as we drift out of the cathedral, past the flickering candles and faint scent of incense, picture the quiet faces of those who believed, completely, desperately, sincerely. They didn't need proof. They just needed hope. And that's something timeless. Let's drift onward. Because next, we're stepping into the royal bedchambers again, where faith, love, and politics all collide, the marriages, meltdowns, and misery of Europe's royal families.